Tick tock, tick tock, tick tock, tick tock, tick. There we go. Okay, so what we want to do today, this afternoon, this evening, this afternoon, we need to look at getting VirtualBox installed. All right. We talked about this a little bit earlier today, I know, and I just want to make sure. Sometimes it seems better if everybody hears it twice. Right? So we're going to back up to the steps that it takes to prepare our host system. Right? We talk about virtual machines. We talk about a host operating system and a guest operating system. Can you turn off your microphone, please, or else I'll just mute everybody, but it seems a little bit radical. Our standard platform is Windows Host or Windows 10, just so I don't get confused with my other one that's Windows 7. And right, Linux guest. We are not using Ubuntu, all right, because Ubuntu has a lot of overheads that are, strictly speaking, unnecessary. These guys at Canonical, I have no clue what their use case is, because mostly it's set up to be a single user desktop machine, except in the background, they've got all of this maintenance stuff going on as if it was part of a cloud installation. And I really have no idea what they're thinking about when they do that, except, you know, you're supposed to install it to the disk and not be concerned about the size if you're using a virtual machine. We are concerned because we want things to be more portable, and we need to have a few virtual machines in order to have a network, all right? And that's why we use our own distro of Linux, all right? Same as any other version when it comes to the Linux part of it, all right? It's just been trimmed down and shrunken, right? So that it runs in a very minimal amount of RAM and requires a very minimal amount of disk space, so that it's quite manageable, quite comfortable, all right, on a normal type of laptop for currently normal laptop, all right? If you're running it on, if you've only got 2 gigabytes of RAM installed on your motherboard, then things get pretty tight. But if you've got 4 gigabytes, it works fine along with everything else, except maybe Teams, all right? Because you get these 4 or 5 virtual machines running, and you get Teams screen sharing and video and things like that, and the processor starts doing the easy bake oven thing. It gets hot. But never mind, we'll avoid that because we've got a lot of good resources at our disposal. We take a look at our Moodle site here. Roll up the magnification a little bit. All right. We've got 3 tabs now. These are tabs across the top. And there will be a few more. There'll be one for the assignment and one for exam review and things like that. But those are forthcoming. All right. Under the general one, we've got the general things. Topics by week, we took a look at that this morning. All right. The PowerPoint are here in the lecture notes folder. All right. There's some additional reference materials, quick references and command references here in this folder. You don't need to worry about that now. And the mytiny.net site, all right, which is critical for us because this is the place where we have all of our software, all right, and all of the documentation for configuring the servers that we use. All right, so this is going to be a place we're going to be on the site as much as we are any place else, okay, through the course of our class. Now, the one thing that's actually not here, all right, is getting Windows prepared, making sure that our host system is ready for action. All right. Let me just pull up that PowerPoint that we looked at a little bit earlier this morning. All right. System requirements. And we took a look at a short list of things that we need to do, all right, before we install VirtualBox. All right. And again, this is important because if we don't do this, we get different kinds of bogons and unexpected sorts of results and things like that. And it's not our fault. It's nothing that we've done wrong. It's just that entropy is setting in to this complex software, this stack of complex software systems. VirtualBox is complex, Linux is complex, Windows itself is complex, and getting all of these things working together, right? We just need to start with a solid foundation, all right? So the first thing to do is to make sure that Windows is all cleaned up, all right? And that's 2 command line commands. There's no way to do this except at PowerShell except PowerShell or the command prompt, all right? And so this is a good way to get started with the command prompt that we'll be using. Right? Just again, I'm going to say this is not a URL, all right? So we've got to have a space between each part of the command here. Each one of these ones that starts with a strip, right? There needs to be a space in that command line. So this one checks back with Windows headquarters, all right, to make sure that all the right libraries and drivers are together. All right, we only need to run this once. We don't need to run it very often. It's just that Windows Update doesn't really meet that 5 nines standard of reliability, and sometimes things get confused. But we need to do this one first because the one that really helps us out, the second one called SFC, it uses the outcome of DISM, all right, in order to make sure that our running system issues are solved, all right? So DISM does the maintenance update, all right? SFC applies that to our Windows system. So no big trick to it, all right? But it just has to be done. Takes a little bit of time, all right? So do it when you have a little bit of time. But yeah, and the important thing is down here, get the Windows system. Command prompt if you like, or PowerShell if you other, and more, and run as administrator, okay? Otherwise, you get that message. Otherwise, you get this message. Elevated permissions are required to run DISM. That's what it means. Elevated command prompt, right click, more, run as administrator. That's important for a lot of deep system tasks. And it's equally important when we actually install VirtualBox. Right, before that, though, before installing VirtualBox, there's one more system check to be done. And that is check the BIOS settings. All right. BIOS is the first thing that runs. It's embedded on the motherboard in the firmware. All right. It's just got to be there. It's basic input-output system. And it sets things up so that we can get going. All right. There's a lot of options in there about the processor and things. We'll be looking at some of those for our virtual machines, right? Because VirtualBox for virtual machines gives us complete access to all of these settings, right? Even though it's a virtual machine, it's very close to what we get with an actual physical hardware machine. All right. So the BIOS setup is one that we need to go in and change one or check one setting. Now you probably may have heard of UEFI, Unified Extensible Firmware Interface. All right, Lenovo says UEFI is expected to replace direct access to the BIOS. That is still far into the future. All right. I don't know. Maybe Lenovo was one of the inventors of it or something, but the UEFI requires some special, weird, and wonderful hardware partitioning. All right. It's supposed to be. It's done for security. It's done to prevent rootkits and boot sector viruses, if they're still around. But the point is, it's only 50% likely that you've got UEFI. Well, if you do, that's great. If you don't, it's also fine. Not a problem. It's just a different way to get access to this BIOS setup utility. All right? But the fact is, the sad fact is, there is no standardization to these BIOS setup utilities, the things that we use to change the BIOS settings. All right. So what we've got to do is track it down. And the place to start, Windows Admin Tools, System Info. Where do we go? Windows Admin Tools, and down the list, System Information. And down at the bottom of the list, oops. Let's shift that across like that for a minute. All right. Virtualization enabled in firmware. If it says yes, you're all finished. Okay. If it says no, then you have to find your way into the BIOS. All right. Some examples, as we said down at the end of the PowerPoint here. All right. If you have UEFI, then you should be able to see this UEFI if you go through the menus here. All right. If you don't have UEFI enabled, then that option does not appear. All right. So if you want to go into the BIOS and turn on UEFI, you have to get to it through the startup screen. All right. And again, everybody has a different key. There's plenty of lists around that you can find, but the easiest way is to just look at your machine, and there's a limited amount of time that this is available, so you have to be quick. All right. Sometimes if it says, you know, F2 or F12 or whatever, sometimes the best thing to do is just keep pressing it while things get started, all right, so that it actually registers. Sometimes that can be just a little bit more painful than it should be, all right? And then once you get in, you probably can get some advice about this, about your make and model, all right? But the name and the location of the virtualization settings is different for all of these different BIOSes, all right? It can show up in different places on the menu. It can have different names, all right? And that is really as much help as anybody can give you in a general way, is that it's a bit of a jungle, all right? But carry on. You do have, if you do get a no on that one, let me know. We can look for some options, all right? I think somebody mentioned this in the tail of the meeting, just didn't really catch it, all right? Some versions of VirtualBox don't need hardware virtualization in the BIOS for 32-bit guests. All right. According to the documentation. In fact, that does not work with some combinations, well, some configurations, I want to say. Windows in on some Intel CPUs, okay? This is a kind of a weird problem with some configurations of Windows, and especially, I think, i5s, i3s, there was an i2 that I saw last semester, all right? So it's not a good solution. The best solution is to turn on virtualization, all right? VMware. Why do you people keep asking me about VMware? All right. No VMware. Clear does not have the settings. Well, it doesn't have enough. Let's say it this way. It doesn't have enough network interfaces. And APU cannot sanction unregistered software. VMware VMware requires, there's no versions of VMware anymore that can use software virtualization. So VMware is no way to sneak around the BIOS problem, okay? And VMware Player is inadequate for what we need. And, you know, you're on your own. You insist on using VMware. I can't imagine why you would ever want to use VMware anyway, because you can, if somebody creates a virtual machine with VMware, VirtualBox understands VDMK disks. So you can just take any VM created with VMware and run it in VBox. There's no trick to it, okay? It just works. And so I don't understand why anybody has any bother with VMware. Just ignore it, and VirtualBox will work fine for you. Okay? Right, let me just check and see if I missed anything here. Okay. All right, so no need for VMware. Okay, so after you get your BIOS in shape, all right, and get your Windows in shape, you just go to the VirtualBox site, the link right down here, and get the current version of VirtualBox. All right. See, there's a note right here. Use version 6.0 if you need software virtualization. But software virtualization only works with 32-bit operating systems, which means that, yeah, it's fine for our TinyNet. But if you want to run any other virtual machine, you're going to need to get that hardware virtualization turned on in your BIOS, because 32-bit operating systems went out of style in 2018. Lots of people stopped building software for them, and they only kept the 64-bit one, all right? But TinyNet built TinyNet 32-bit because it doesn't need to be any bigger than that, and it was all good for software virtualization up until probably, I don't know, March or April this year, when Windows 10 started doing funny things, and sometimes even these lower versions that should work will not on particular combinations of Windows and some processors. Okay? So 6.1.26 is fine. Now, VirtualBox comes in two parts, all right? One's called the extension pack and one called the platform packages. We only need the platform packages. This is the, what do they call it? Open source licensed code in VirtualBox. Their extension pack, all right? This is, what do I want to say? This is the parts that have software patent issues or different kinds of licenses. The intellectual property side is more tightly controlled, all right? But we don't need any of these characteristics, all right? And so all we need is the platform package. And you download the platform package that is appropriate for the operating system that is close to your hardware, all right? So for me, I've got Windows 10 here. That's what we're looking at. I need the one for Windows hosts. All right, there's one for OS X. There's one for Linux in general, and for the Solaris distribution as a legacy gesture to Sun Microsystems, who invented VirtualBox, and also invented Java. That is useful in your trivia. But just to take a look here, let me show you something about VirtualBox. All right. 6/21/26 was released the 28th of July. All right. 6/1/24 was released a week earlier. All right. 6/1/22 was released the 29th of April. All right. So that was like 8-10 weeks between 22 and 24, 8 days between 24 and 26. All right. 20, oh, look at this. 6.1.20, again, released on the 20th of April, and then another one 9 days later. All right. And this is typical. All right. The 6.1.18 was January, 20 was April. Look at all the bugs that were fixed. And there's more bugs fixed here 9 days later. There's more bugs fixed here a couple of months later. There's more bugs fixed here a week later. The point is, whatever version you have is going to have a list of bugs. And sometime in the future, could be near future, but only every few months, right, it's going to get replaced with a new version that fixes the bugs in the one you have, but carries a whole list of new ones all by itself, which are going to get fixed in another version, which has its own list that's going to get fixed. You see where I'm going with this? There's no point in trying to keep up with the VirtualBox release cycle. All right? You need a version that works, that is stable, okay? And then if anything happens, you need to change, you can change at some point in the future. So the other thing to note is that 6.1.20, all right, and again, 6.1.22, all right, fixed some issues with Windows Hyper-V integration, frequent crashes of 64. Ooh, well, Windows Vista, ooh, that's a terrible one as well. But anyway, there was some really significant fixes here in 6.1.20, all right? And so anything better than 6.1.20 is worth it. It's good, it's fine. It's going to be useful for the medium to long term, okay? So just get the most current one, get it installed, and carry on using it until somehow there's some compelling reason to change. All right? Now, where were we? Okay. So when you download VirtualBox, there's only two things to remember about installing VirtualBox. Wait a minute, let me go back up here a little bit. Here's the BIOS. All right, there we go. All right, so I put 6.1.20 here. Whatever's current is the good one. All right, the platform pack is what you absolutely need. Okay, and that's the one that matches your operating system that controls your hardware. All right, and the one thing is, two things here. Right-click and run as administrator when you install it, all right? And again, that's just find it in your downloads folder. If you put it in your downloads folder, but just find it in your downloads folder and, ooh, where did it go? All right. And all you have to do is right click and tick-tock, Windows. All right. It pops up the menu and you just choose Run as Administrator. All right. This is important because VirtualBox needs to install some low-level drivers. All right. And if you don't run it as administrator, those drivers won't get installed correctly, and your virtual machine network will not work correctly because the drivers are not properly installed. All right. So just right-click it, run as administrator. All right. Experience has shown that VirtualBox works best when you install it from to the default location. Okay, C program files is the one that comes up. It's not that big, all right, and the path to your virtual machines when you create your virtual machines and such, that one can be anywhere you want it to be, all right, and so you're not going to save any space by installing VirtualBox to a non-standard location. And somehow it seems that somebody, maybe they fixed it in one of these bug fix releases. Somebody left a hard-coded path inside the code. And so sometimes, once in a while, if you install it to a non-standard place, all right, you get these unintended consequences and unexpected results, all right? So just let it install itself to its default location, and then you can put your virtual machines in another place if space is a concern for your installation. Right, the fourth step, and this one is where we want to get next week, all right, is create our first virtual machine, all right? Now, the way we get started is, I'm gonna put this in the chat here to make sure everybody gets the message, all right? We create one VM and call it to clone. All right. This is our standard template VM. We never use it except to create other. All right. So what we do is we create one VM and install the operating system on it, do some basic configuration, all right? And then we never use it again except to clone it off and create another VM, all right? Saves us a ton of work in basic configuration. It's like we have it just sitting up on the shelf and we pull it down and magically clone it off to a machine that we can configure for any other purpose. But we know that it's basically working and it has a standard configuration. Okay, so we need to create our two-clone machine and use it a little bit later to create our other ones. But there's a few steps of basic configuration that we need to do to this 2 clone before we start cloning them off and using in other places. Now, it says download the base ISO from mytiny.net. Okay, hold on just 1 second. Okay, if you're getting that message that says it did some repairs, don't bother looking at the details of it, all right? But do go back and just touch up arrow, all right? You get this message here, all right? Then just touch up arrow, get that command back, and run that scan again, all right? And then when you get this message, did not find any integrity violations, okay? That's when you want to power off, all right? Power off your machine, bring it back on, start it up again, and carry on with a big smile on your face because you've fixed some problems you didn't even know you had. All right. Where to put the VMs? Here we go. All right. When you're creating a VM, you have to look in your file and preferences. All right. File up here in the VirtualBox menu, same place it is everywhere else. All right. And then in preferences, you can set your default machine folder to any place you like. Don't mess with the VDRP thing here. But you can set this to any place you like. But beware, all right? If you set this to a removable disk, all right, you're going to have to go in and update this drive letter if it changes. Because for whatever reason, I don't know, VirtualBox always uses these full Windows paths, including the drive letter in its internal configuration files, all right? So this is where you change the default machine folder. Put them wherever you like, right? As I was saying, all right? As I was saying, VirtualBox works best if you install the app in the default place, program files. But it doesn't take up that much space. It's a couple of megabytes of not, I don't know. It's small. It's not big. All right. Virtual machines, they can get big. You may want to keep those on a different partition, a different drive. I mean, I keep mine on my D partition, and my C partition is for Windows. Okay, so all good. And all you have to do is adjust this default machine folder setting, and it will put them there and run them from there. Okay? Right. One more thing before we wrap up here, all right? When you change that, I put a note down here to remind myself of this. If you change the default machine folder, there's a couple of things that are like this, all right? You change the default machine folder, type in the one that you want, hit OK, and then exit VirtualBox, all right? That means VirtualBox will write its configuration file. Sometimes, rarely, I'm not sure how exactly it happens, but sometimes VirtualBox can lose the settings in this preferences if you do too many things after you change them, all right? And there's only 1 or 2 times where that's important, but this one, I would say, is probably one of them. All right. When you create the VM, right, you're going to find a menu that has a whole lot of options here for different operating systems. It even has OS2, if anybody remembers what that is. All right. But you need to choose Linux, and you need to go through the list. There's a bunch of distros on there, right? And VirtualBox uses this to configure the hardware, all right? So it's important to get this right. And this one says current kernel of Linux 234, 32-bit compilation, 32-bit operating system, all right? And that's the one. Don't choose 64 because it's not better, because it doesn't match what the operating system actually is, all right? Our operating system is kernel 4.19 or something like that, 4.x, and 32-bit. So that's the one to choose on this menu. The rest of it is all pretty straightforward, all right? And after that, there's one more slide here. This is one slide that I've left in. There, I don't know, done a lot of intensive debugging since with some of the more current versions of Windows Update, all right? And there, again, some configurations of Windows with the P3s, P5s, CPUs, all right, need to have Hyper-V disabled, all right? Everybody raves about 6.1.20 and how much better it works with Hyper-V on than the previous versions of VirtualBox, all right? But there's still some configurations where we have to go in and do one more step, which is get into your control panel, programs and features, turn features on or off, and turn off, make sure that there's all of these settings are white boxed, all right, rather than black boxed. Not a problem of Windows 10 Home Edition versus Pro versus Enterprise. It's not that, it's something else, all right, something to do with the Windows configuration and the processor in the machine, okay? All right, we're going to run out of time here, but one last thing before we go, all right? It mentioned the documentation, all right? Two things. First one here is, oops, where's my MyTinyNet site? All right. First one, MyTinyNet site, get the MyTiBase ISO. That's the only one we need at this point. That is the whole core operating system, right? The Conf ISO has the specialized software for DNS and mail and things like that. We'll get to that in a week or so, all right? So that's off the MyTiVM images. README, it's probably a good idea if you want to get oriented to it. Getting started, creating VMs. This is a PDF, all right, of a PowerPoint presentation, and it takes you through the whole thing, screenshot by screenshot, okay? The whole process of setting up your first virtual machine. And again, we just need the first one, and we call it our 2-clone virtual machine, okay? Because we're going to use it as the base for all of our others. Also, here on Moodle, in the TinyNet-based system videos, we've got video support. All right. Create the VM in VirtualBox and prepare the hard disk. These videos, they're in two parts because I use Screencastify that has a 5-minute limit, okay? But these first two videos, 2Clone1 and 2Clone2, cover exactly the same territory as this PDF document does here, all right? Just to say, you'll notice that I didn't get around to updating the screenshots. This is the VirtualBox 5 interface, all right? It looks just a tiny bit different than the version 6 interface, but it's only the first top menu. Once you get inside, everything is exactly the same. It's just a slightly different icon layout that in version 5 and version 6. All right, and so we've still got some of our videos that were done with version 5 of VirtualBox. But don't let that bother you. It's just a little change in the organization of the icons. Once you get inside, everything is exactly the same. Once you get in here to the settings menu, all right, all of this is the same for VirtualBox versions. Been the same since version 4. Okay. Any questions?
No, sir. All clear.
All good.